There is a moment that most men only recognize in hindsight, long after the dust has settled. It's a moment when there is no one left to explain things to, and the room becomes so quiet that his own breath sounds louder than usual. This moment isn't dramatic. It isn't loud. It doesn't carry the weight of a massive crisis. It doesn't feel like a breakup, or a heated argument, or the kind of obvious loss you can easily put a name to. It arrives in silence, moving under the radar. And that is why it is more dangerous than any shock a man has ever endured. It is the moment he realizes he no longer wants to explain himself. It's not that he has nothing left to say. In fact, inside him, there is a sea of unspoken thoughts, unnamed emotions, and words that have never been given a voice. But a subtle shift occurs in his consciousness, a shift that makes every word feel heavy, not because the words are wrong, but because they no longer have a place to land. He begins to feel that every time he opens his mouth to justify his actions, he is entering a space where his worth is up for negotiation, where his feelings must be proven, and where his very existence needs a logical reason to be accepted. And at some point, his body reacts before his mind can even find an excuse. He goes silent. Many men mistake this for apathy. They think they've grown numb, or that they simply don't care anymore. But the truth runs much deeper. A man stops explaining, not because he doesn't care, but because he cared for too long, cared to the point of losing his own center. For years, he believed that if he was clear enough, calm enough, rational enough, and patient enough, he would eventually be understood. He believed that misunderstandings were glitches that could be fixed with language, that emotional gaps could be bridged by conversations lasting until midnight, that sincerity, if presented correctly, had the inherent power to save everything. But what few men realize is this: there are points in a relationship where being understood is no longer a shared goal. When one person continues to explain while the other has stopped listening, it is no longer communication. It is a form of self-erosion. Each sentence doesn't bring the two people closer. It only pushes the speaker a little further away from himself. It happens slowly, discreetly, but relentlessly, until the man realizes he is no longer speaking from a position of equality, but from the position of someone begging to be validated, begging for permission to exist as he is. The real breaking point isn't in the final word spoken. It's in the moment he begins to observe himself while he is explaining. It's when he notices his voice has changed. It's no longer steady or natural, but carries an invisible hesitation. It's when he realizes he is choosing words, not to express the truth, but to avoid making someone else uncomfortable. It's when he sees himself constantly looping back to the past, repeating his motives, restating his intentions, explaining things that shouldn't need explaining. If the connection were still alive, and right there, a deep part of him understands. If I have to say this much just to stay, then perhaps I haven't truly been here for a long time. When that man stops explaining, the outside world usually doesn't change immediately. Others might not even notice that something has happened. But inside him, an old order collapses. The order in which he defined himself through the feedback of others. The order in which his value was reflected in whether or not he was understood. When that structure dissolves, it feels like an uncomfortable void at first. He feels empty, disoriented, sometimes even guilty. He is so used to the constant labor of connecting, of keeping everything okay. Now that he has stopped, He isn't sure who he is without that burden. Yet, in that very void, something else begins to take shape. For the first time in a long time, his energy isn't leaking out. It's no longer being consumed by the need for validation or acceptance. It flows back inward, slowly, hesitantly, like a stream that was diverted too far, and is finally finding its way back to the source. And with that energy comes a new question. Not a question about the other person. Not why are they like this, or what did I do wrong, but a quieter, heavier question. Where do I stand in my own life? This question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It doesn't rush him, but it begins to restructure his perception. He looks back at the times he over-explained, not to blame himself, but to understand. He sees the difference between sharing and pleading, between expressing himself and asking for permission to be himself. In that clarity, he doesn't become colder. He just becomes more precise with his energy. People think a man stops explaining because he has closed off his heart. Usually, the opposite is true. He closes the door to places that can no longer listen, so that he can keep his emotions from being distorted. He hasn't abandoned his truth. He has only abandoned the need to convince others of it. That surrender creates a very quiet, very deep kind of freedom. A freedom that doesn't need to be announced, proven, or understood right away. When a man moves through this stage, he doesn't become a different person. He just returns to the essence of who he was. Before he learned he had to explain himself to survive. He speaks less, but each word carries more weight. He is no longer in a hurry to fix his image in the eyes of others, not because he is arrogant, but because he understands that some images don't need to be fixed. They just need to be walked away from. In that silence, he doesn't lose his voice. He finds the place where his voice actually begins. The greatest change isn't in his behavior. It's in his internal posture. He is no longer standing on the edge of the relationship, waiting to be called in. He is standing at the center of himself. From that position, he can stay, or he can leave without a long-winded monologue. Not because he is heartless, but because he has stopped confusing being understood with living truthfully. Ultimately, when everything settles, that man realizes something simple yet profound. Silence is not losing. Silence only feels like losing when it comes from fear. But when silence comes from clarity, from no longer needing to justify your existence, it isn't the end. It is the return. When he stops explaining, it's not because he has run out of words. It's because he has finally found the place where words are no longer necessary to confirm his worth.